Hello everyone. Yesterday, May 23rd, was a very interesting day in the markets as we just pressed all-time highs into the overnight session. And all of a sudden, throughout the day, we got this massive reoffer and just continuous sell throughout, especially at the end of the day. So what I'm going to be doing is reviewing that day itself, as well as mainly talking about what a bearish DOM looks like and how to keep the context in mind as the day progresses to stay on side. So first and foremost, right, I'll do a little review and breakdown of the profiles here on the S&P and NASDAQ to get a better sense of what's going on realistically. And then we'll take a look at both the DOMs on the S&P and the NASDAQ on a replay feature. So when we look at these, what's going on right now is I want to identify where the big distributions are so I can keep some kind of contextual background. So I got this like fairly thick distribution that lines up here on the S&P 500 from the 24 into that 48, we can say. So when I'm looking at this, right, this is the overnight session over here, and I want to be positioned for the continued direction. So what happened in this case was that we were about to open outside of this distribution. So there's technically some bullish momentum behind this. What would quantify that bullish momentum is if we actually hold a bid and they continuously rebid into this like 47, 45, 48 area. So that's what would be the contextual continuation of this move. But if we manage to accept into a distribution, right, you can see that this is a distribution for the week itself. It's very thick in the middle. This is where the most volume gets traded. So if the case that happens is that the bear side actually opens up under this, what that's telling us that market participants are getting very heavy on the sell side that want to actually move into such a thick area of volume, which puts downside pressure in this. Another thing to note is that the volume into the highs was fairly heavy. You got this like kind of P-shaped volume profile that puts a lot of emphasis into the highs in terms of volume. That gets a little top heavy. All this volume that's accumulated into these highs right now is if there's that much volume on the buy side, we should have honestly continued to see a swing to the higher end. But all this accumulation into this high, it's a little worrisome for the continuation of the buy side. So if there's an aspect that moves back through into this area on very heavy selling, then realistically what I'm going to be watching for is going to be that downside momentum. And as long as we can accept into like little distribution areas within this distribution, suggesting that if we move under this 36, right, there's more downside pressure. So I'm looking at it from a contextual experience as well in terms of the structural moves through these distributions. If we keep accepting lower and lower and lower, well, realistically, the case is we're going to see moves lower. You start accepting under this 21 area cleanly on big sellers, right? The next target becomes into this 5,300 area, and then so on down into this like 80, low 70 region over here. So when we look at this on the replay feature, it's a very definitive understanding of what a bearish DOM looks like. You get this opening drive move that just goes constant sell, and every time we pop up, you get a reoffer. So the reoffer is when we're looking at this DOM, right, we're looking at these middle columns where there's like market sellers, market buyers. On the reoffer, what happens is that on every pop, there's harsher selling. What I mean by that is size and pace. When we watch the order flow, especially on the DOM, we're looking at the pace of the movement. So if there's just big sellers that come in and they sweep away the buy side, that's pace, that's aggression, that's what a reoffer looks like. Let's say, for example, we come into an area as a resistance and they constantly just sell more aggressively. Think of it dynamically. So you start running up. Like, let's say this move takes like 3 minutes and then boom, it drops down in a minute. You run up, takes 2 minutes, drops down in 30 seconds. That is an over-encompassing aspect of wanting to see the pace of the movement of the sellers. Obviously, if there's very large quantities and they continuously sell into a low, as we'll see, there's going to be the aspect that this is a continuation to the downside. On the other hand, the rebid would be, let's say, an area of support here, and they're constantly going market buy, and actually sustaining price against those large sellers. So it's a combination of a fight and who wins with more speed. So why don't we get right into this? Let's do the replay. We'll be back when these things are replayed, and we'll also take a look at the NASDAQ in that sense. So we'll put the replay on. We'll take a look at the NASDAQ structural component as well. and then we'll jump right into this. So why don't we get started? So let's take a look at this NASDAQ from a structural perspective as well. NASDAQ ran into new highs realistically off that NVIDIA news. And we can see like the start of the heavier volume actually gets dropped off closer to 840. So it's a long ways away. What we can do is actually zoom in and take a look at the individual overnight session to give us a little more of an idea of what's going on here. So what I can see from this overnight individual session is that into this region, we start with very heavy volume close to 900. What we also have is the point of control from the overnight session that sits somewhere into this 940, 930 area. So realistically, we have a drop off in volume, which is interesting to me. You have that 930-ish, we can say 930, 925. So if I just break these down and try to cut them out, what I'm going to see is that from a distribution and auction perspective, right, if we clean up a lot of this volume to the downside, right, this area should hold if we're going to see any real bidding. Otherwise, we start cleaning up the auction to the downside and you get this more extensive move lower. So when I look at this more extensive move lower, if we start dropping under this like 930, 925, the offers should really hit through this and we could get some downside momentum. It's very bearish once we break this like 840, 850 area to the downside on NAS, where we accept back into this larger distribution where most likely you'll be trading into that like 800. You'll be looking for 800, then you'll be looking for potentially that like 770, 760, and then so on to the downside. So it's really dependent for me, like if we can actually hold into this like 930, 920 area for that buy side momentum to actually continue this leg higher. Otherwise, at that point, right, you have levels that are much lower that could be tested, where it gets a little iffy for me to buy, right? Maybe like 840, 850 becomes like the last chance. Otherwise, we just accept lower and there's more downside momentum that will persist. So let's look at this. Let's look at the DOM and the order flow, how it shapes up, so we can see what a opening drive bearish move looks like and what a continued reoffer looks like. So what I've done is I just moved the tick charts here so we can see it from a visual perspective as well. And let's start this replay here. So right now, this is like the market open on the replay here. And what I'm noticing right away is you can see, right, there's very heavy large selling against very heavy large buying. So let's just do a quick pause here. We haven't seen too much action just yet. It's like 30 seconds in. But what I've noticed right away is that there's very large sell quantities that are actually holding out price to the downside, as well as very large sell quantities here on NASDAQ that are holding against the buy side. So like if I'm looking at this and trying to compare these two, you're seeing like very thick quantities, which aren't fully normal, I would say, on NASDAQ. You're getting like hundreds and whatnot, higher numbers against the buy side, and we're clearly reacting to the bear. So it's very early right now. You're getting like the 30 seconds off the open. And we have some areas that we're fairly interested in right here, NASDAQ into 930 and on the S&P into that 47, 48. But we want to watch how they persist because the reactions are very important here. Because if large sellers come in on both of these, you're starting to see that they're just engulfing all that buy side and sweeping lower. So with NASDAQ and the S&P here, if I'm looking at them side by side, the larger quantities here, they continuously sell lower and lower and lower, bigger quantities, right? 600s against 700 buyers. NASDAQ, you're seeing like 40s against 40s, right? 50s against 50s. We're moving down close to areas that we care about a little here, right? Into that 930 area. So and not only do I want to wait for the regions based on the auctions, but I want to see how the order flow comes in. So here's a quick pause. What we saw here on NASDAQ just now is someone goes in market sell into about 100 orders. Massive delta gets formed here, and we just immediately drive lower, right? This is not a very bullish sign. On the S&P, you've seen that massive orders on the buy side are trying to come in right at the ask, which are seeing like 900, 700, and against them coming in at the bid are like 600, 700s. And the reaction that comes in from that, right, is telling you that, okay, the momentum right now is sticking a little more to the downside. So as we approach these levels, we would want to see some kind of bullish reaction if there's going to be any kind of momentum that holds this thing up. But right now, off this drive, what you're seeing is just large quantities, right? Like Nasdaq just sold another 100 lots and just immediately dropped down 10 handles, right? The S&P right now is selling very large quantities, 700s, and immediately dropped lower. So Nasdaq trades into the 930. They bounce off that level fairly cleanly here. But I want to see, right, this is where the concept of the rebid and the reoffer comes in. So on the rebid, if I'm looking at this as a buyer, right, I want to see constant large buyers stepping in at the area that we care about. So if I outline this at 930 over here, right, into this area somewhere, what I'd like to see is, okay, you have some big sellers that are coming in, right? People coming in at the bid, and they're 60s, right, 50s, and against them you have similar quantities that actually try to push price up. Same thing here. If I'm coming into this area 46, 47 on the SPOOs, I want to see something very similar, but I want to see the concept of the rebid. The rebid allows us to see multiple tests of this area per se that allow for big buyers to step in continuously and try to actually hold this price up. So if I'm looking at this to continue the move, right, I'm just fresh into this market. I have no other information for the remainder of the day. I want to see that these buyers in these areas are actually trying to hold these prices out. So right now, you're seeing still large sell quantities coming in. You're seeing the reaction come in a little more aggressively every time we sell down, which is not fully what I would love to see per se, right? There's some decent quantities that are trying to hold this up right now into that 930. So let's see if we can test that 930 again, and there's some decent buying. People coming in at the ask and swinging it back up, that becomes an opportunity for me to look at this and say, okay, great, there's some buy side momentum. But if we pop up, like let's say 10 handles, and we drop down those same 10 handles much more aggressively, then in that case, I'm seeing that fluctuation between the buy and the sell that's more aggressive on the sell side. So as we come back down to this area here on Nasdaq, right, the S&P hasn't really seen any reaction on the rebid to the upside. Nasdaq's starting to show some kind of qualities about that, right? So it's not a bad look necessarily. So I want to keep watching this, right? We've tested twice into this 930 region. We've popped up about 10 handles here on Nasdaq. It's not looking like awful per se, right? This becomes one of the last chances that I would want to be a buyer, other than that level closer to like 840, 850. And now we're starting to see a little more volatility and volume coming in, large sell quantities. S&P doing something similar, right? You have 700s here coming in fighting. 900 comes in on the buy side here on the S&P. Nasdaq comes down to test the area again, right? What we're seeing is large sell quantities that come in, and they allow for a push higher. So like when I see something like that, honestly, like that test, it wasn't bad at all, right? Like if I'm looking at this, it's not a bad test at all. So on Nasdaq, if I'm long into this like low 930, right, you're getting a pretty nice move here. You're getting 20, 25 handles, which this looks like a pretty decent opportunity for that buy side, right? And then what happens right there, let's pause this quickly. The S&P, not really so much, so I'm kind of focused on the Nasdaq. What happens right there is you see a lot of traders coming in at the bid, right? They go market sell, kind of 100 quantities, and they kind of reject that area. So like if I'm long into these 930s right now, based on that prior analysis, at this point, like I'm trying to take some profit, because if I'm long this, I want to see continuous buying that comes in, people trading at the ask and try to swing it higher. What I saw instead was like people trading at the ask and then reoffer right away, right? You can see, okay, hundreds come in, they sell, they push it down immediately. So we're kind of creating a blockade over here. S&P hasn't really done too much to tell us, okay, this looks like a decent long, but the Nasdaq's already ran about 20 points, right? So in this case, I do like this, but we have to see continuation that allows flushes to the upside. So in these areas, if I'm looking at this, like the delta areas, I'm looking at like larger deltas. I'm looking at where areas where market buyers or people that came in at the ask that traded large quantities and would want to push higher. So if I can get that push above like 956, I really like this for a continuation, and that could be our pullback on the day. So again, keep in mind, I know that we dropped off fairly aggressively on the day session, But if I'm looking at this real time, honestly, this doesn't look bad for me. We rebid the area a few times into like 930, 933, and we're holding up about 20 handles right now, just over 20 handles. So this doesn't look bad, but you have to see that continuation if you want to hold this out or if you want to buy this area again. So we want to see if we come back into the area and we get a next test of these like 930s and just like someone comes in on a massive market sell into the lows, it doesn't look very good. So right now they're fighting this area where like big buyers came in, Reoffer comes into this area. So it's not great for the continuation right now. I would like to see them just like sweep through this like 955, 956. But what we're seeing is people are coming in on the market sell, reacting more harshly. You just saw that reoffer that just came in 10 handles. They keep selling larger quantities here, right? 70s, 30s, 50s that are allowing for sellers to look at this and be like, okay, great. Like this is a sell opening drive right now. S&P hasn't seen anything. People come in massive market sells here as we're trying to hold into this 46. No one comes in on the buy side. We're starting to move below our suggested region that the buyers would want to hold out at this point. So once we start getting that move about like 5-6 points on the S&P to the downside, I start to get very, very worried about the continuation of the buyer, right? At this point, I would like to see if we can actually rally back above this like 49 and hold a bit on that. The NASDAQ, again, we come into the same area, 950s right here. And let's see, okay, they're trying to push up, right? 953 comes in. 953, a big cluster of deltas, they reject on a pretty harsh reoffer there. So they're reoffering the same area that they did before. They're still holding above our 930, but we're starting to see the pace of this DOM start shifting. So larger quantities coming in on the sell side, and they're more reactive, more aggressive than the buy side. So if I'm long this, right, I'm trying to taper off and see, okay, can we move into a break-even stop and look for some kind of continuation above these 955s? The S&P isn't giving me much to work with right now. It's a little droopier, and we haven't really rebid the area that I wanted to on the S&P. So there's nothing there at this point, right? If we're looking at this logically on this replay. And we're seeing at 46, you see some very large sellers coming in on the S&P. Some buyers are trying to fight it right now. When they go such large quantities, right, on the bid or the ask at market on the S&P, I like to see a very reactive move from those guys. So if someone's like buying like hundreds and hundreds of lots, they're throwing them in, I would like to see this thing sweep up, right? I'd like to see them push up aggressively, hold the area again, rebid large quantities again, push it up. And what we're seeing right now is the reactive sell. There's more of a reaction here to the downside. NASDAQ coming into the area that created all this negative delta into these like the low 930s. And the fact that we're pushing below it with a little more aggression at this point, I'm not wanting to be a buyer into these areas, right? I've had my chance. And at this point, right, what happens here is this large area of delta that was prior, I guess like minor absorption, is now getting large sell quantities that are adding into it, and we're moving below more aggressively. So at that point, right, there's no rebid here. There's no reason for me to be long right now. And if we accept under this 930, realistically, the next test is going to be between 840 and 850 to hold some of that buy side. That's like the final straw. Otherwise, we accept into the larger distribution, that balance for the week. If we accept into that balance for the week, you're starting to see some downside press. But it gets very droopy here on the structural perspective if we start accepting under 930, because 930, 920 become a resistance that the sellers are going to want to play into later on. Realistically, the S&P, no one aggressively tried to buy into this like 47, 48 area. We're trading much below right now. So we're starting to see the acceptance into this distribution lower. And if there's a constant market seller that comes in, right, then we got to just look for this downside. Like, look, the NASDAQ is now down 10 handles under that area that was getting rebid prior. You're starting to see the large sell quantities, right? There's a little buy side press. And if everything makes a little more sense into this 930, 940, they should hold those big sellers that originally came in to sustain what we call that reoffer. And there's that downside drive. You can see the aggression that's coming in right now. Not only are we moving down more aggressively, but the large sellers are holding out. Whenever they come in, they're holding out more of the move to the downside. So every time we pop, big sellers come in, they push it lower, right? This allows us to see, okay, now we traded 914, 915. We're now about like 15, 20 points below the big area that was interesting for us to see that upside continuation. and large orders keep coming in here, right? They're fighting on the NASDAQ at these areas at this 920. That's creating yet another bubble for us, right? Of prior very heavy activity. So we see like big buyers come in, big sellers come into this area. This is a big fight. So whoever wins this fight right now, you can see the downside press. This becomes an area that I'm fairly interested in to see pullbacks into, so we can actually sell down because we're now accepted into this distribution lower. The reoffer is continuous, right? Very large quantities that continuously push this thing lower. The S&P as well. We've created these clusters into that 945, 946 that have created very large at the bid trading, right? Market orders that are coming in that are sweeping prices lower. So that becomes an area where we've cleanly accepted into this larger distribution to the downside. We should theoretically hold that downside momentum move. So if I'm a seller on both of these, I would want a little more reaction to the downside so I can I can sell into it as we pop up. Because for NASDAQ, right, a general rule of thumb is that if we have an area like this, right, I'd like to see a sweep about like 20 points below. On the S&P, about like 8 points below. So if I'm trying to sell 46, right, that's okay enough. 46, 47, we've accepted under that distribution. NASDAQ, if I'm trying to sell, it'll probably be closer to like the 930, maybe mid 920s, where all that reactivity happened from the prior move. If I'm going to see this continued downside momentum in these markets right now. So the prior activity that really sparked this, right, we tried to hold the bid into these 930s before. We swept under them aggressively. These guys right now on these offers should hold into that 930, low 930 area to continue this power move to the downside, very similarly to this 46 on the S&P. So we're getting a lot of reactivity here. It's jumping around a lot. This replay is a little wonky right now, but that's fine. And you're seeing more volatility that comes in, right? I think at this point somewhere there's news, right? That was a news drop, so it's a little difficult to see. But we dropped very heavily from that 930, right? 925 to 930 should hold on the offer. That's where the big reoffers came in to actually sweep this thing lower. So we're coming back into that area on the NASDAQ. And what we're seeing is massive sellers coming in 925. So we've marked up a region, 925 to 930. That's where massive reoffers came in. You can see the reaction from these larger sellers that are coming into this area, and they would want to hold all those prior sellers that came in on that reoffer to sustain some of this downside. So again, right, you see larger quantities that build up into this area, and what's the reaction from them, right? You can see like 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s coming in at the bid, pushing lower every sweep that they get, right? Some buyers are trying to fight them right into this 925, 930 area, 5-point region that marks off a big sell. Right at this point, you're seeing constant. They press it, they reoffer it. They press it, they reoffer it. They press it, they reoffer it. Look at these like larger quantities over here. So let's pause this for a second. On the S&P, it's a very similar thing. I'm focused a lot more on the NASDAQ right now because the areas and the reactivity is much cleaner. You can see over here, right, what happened into this area. We get a few rebids, people getting trapped a little on the sell side. We get a pop about 20, 25 points. What gets created over there? What gets created is a delta cluster over here and a massive seller that created this larger downside move. We come back towards the area again, they have a large sell. So if I'm looking at these quantities over here specifically, I'm looking at, okay, there's very large sellers, there's decent buyers, but what's the reaction? The reaction, the pace is that every time they come in and a big seller comes in, they push lower. So if I mark up an area, it's going to be somewhere over here, right? 925 into 930, where we're starting to see that reoffer consistently come in that puts some downside pressure on this market. So realistically, this area becomes a huge region that would target down to 950, 940, where I'd expect based on the auction to see some of that upside or some buyers at least come in. Similar notion into this S&P, like this 45 area. If I'm looking at where these big sellers come in, where they start that reactive move, it's within that region. Every time we come in, we see a larger downside press based on the quantities that are coming in. So if I'm looking at this, right, I'm seeing who's fighting, because if we have two large quantities coming in at the bid and at the ask, right, the reaction from that, the pace from that is what's telling me who's in control and the general notion of the DOM. So if I'm looking at if the DOM is bullish or bearish, I'm looking at what the reactions from these big buyers and sellers are. I want to take context into place, because contextually we've just accepted into this distribution, which leads to more downside towards the bottom of this band. But at the same time, I want to see, okay, if I'm moving up like this slowly and I'm dropping like this, moving up like this slowly, dropping like this on quantities, right? This is going to be a reflection of the DOM that tells me, okay, there's more bearishness on this DOM. There's more bearishness in this market. So as long as we can stay under this like 45 area, there's going to be some downside press. As long as we can stay under 925, 930 on the NASDAQ, there's going to be some downside press, right? Every time they come into it, I'm seeing larger quantities come in on the sell side. And what are they doing? They're reacting to the downside very aggressively, right? They're reacting to sweep these things lower very aggressively. So again, large quantity comes in here right at that 930. What happens? We just drop 10 handles in a flash on this NASDAQ. So it'd be great if we see a new low, obviously, but they're still holding on the reoffer and they're getting consistent. Even into these lows, they're selling large quantities and the reaction is starting to go to the downside press. Not that I'm saying, okay, let me just market sell into this low. I had my area before and it's looking very good. S&P coming into a new region into this 35 area. If we sweep below that on heavy sellers, that really narrows it down for us and tells us, okay, that this is a big sell. They're selling large quantities into these lows on NASDAQ right now, into this like 915 area. And what's the reaction? The reaction is to the downside, continuously reoffered. And there goes that downside press. So we narrowed down an area, a lot of rotations into there, providing, what is that, like 30, 40 points right now. And if we're going to see this sweep continue, we will want to see areas that previously reoffered, which puts us into the position of 912, 915, hold on to that offer. You can see here, they're fighting for their lives right now, these buyers versus sellers. There's large quantities on both sides, right? And who's coming out on top right now? It seems like the sell side's more reactive to the downside. They keep offering and offering and offering and offering into the lows with big buyers coming in. And they just use that buy side as liquidity to sweep just lower and lower and lower. So the S&P into 38 just created a massive delta over here. This becomes a very big barrier for us to continuously look for this sell. As long as we can hold it around that area, right, where we saw like 1500 coming on into the bid and we push lower like 4 handles, that's what a reoffer looks like. That's what a reoffer is shaping up to be realistically. So as the DOM progresses and these big sellers or big buyers come in, and we already know, okay, the general notion of the DOM is bearish at this point, we can pinpoint the areas where these guys have come in and we can just sell into them to continue this leg lower. So here we go. We come into this delta area, 910, 915 on NASDAQ, and what happens? A sweep to the downside, massive reoffer, already down 20 handles from that area. S&P same, 37 trades, reoffer comes in. Very bearish DOM here that's telling you, okay, if you want to be a buyer that badly, you're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait to see what kind of quantities come into this area so that we can see that there is some kind of reactivity that buyers are actually coming in. Because every time a big buyer comes in, the sellers get more aggressive and they allow for this press lower and they just hold a consistent offer, reoffer. So it's not like I want to jump into these blindly. I don't want to just like chase this. I want to notice where we had consistent reoffering and big selling on these DOMs so I can join that party. So we come in, we're dropping lower here, S&P continuously selling into these lows. We're fairly close to 24. 24 is a barrier for us, such as this 850 to 845 on NASDAQ, right? Those become like the final chances to find buyers based on our auction that we had discussed earlier in this video. So if I'm going to be a buyer, right, I'm going to have to wait for those areas to see if anyone wants to come in. But that 930, 925 on NASDAQ that we noticed where those reoffers came in, even into that like 912 area, are holding extremely well. So those are those like minor pullbacks that we can see based on the order flow that tell us these are regions that should sustain if we're going to see some kind of downside press. So far, so good. Everything's leaning on the bear side right now. And we also want to remember where those guys came in, because if we test those areas, which does happen later into, I think, the afternoon, we have the same reaction. They're doing the same things into those areas. So let's see down here, because there's going to be a bounce into this like 950, 940 area on the NASDAQ, as well as the 24s on the S&P. And I think it's very, very important to locate where that bounce actually appears. So as we look at this so far, it's looking very bearish, right? Every time we come up, we just reoffer aggressively. And you're starting to see some kind of information that's telling you, okay, like there's some big selling that happens into this low close to this like 955, 855 on the NASDAQ. And there's some kind of buying, but it's not like super aggressive. Like they're holding a few rebids here. Great, right? They come in, they bid it a few times, but it's not necessarily at the key region that I want to hunt. I'm not going to be aggressive, especially with this large downside move off this open. So here comes the S&P into that 24, NASDAQ into the 850 area. And this is where it gets a little interesting for us. So large quantities come in on the sell into 850, right? A massive buyer comes in on the S&P, right? They come in at the ask about 1,000 orders, right? It lights up right here. So if we can see a reaction, which is coming, right? They're popping above this area. That's telling you, okay, this region is actually holding out to some of this buy side. 850, 845 NASDAQ, what happens? Massive sellers come in, they hold on a pretty flashy bid. Let's see the second test. I like to see two tests, if they can get absorbed or stuck into a low and there's a nice rebid off that area. Again, same thing. So we get a large, massive sellers like 60s before there were a couple of hundred. They rebid it aggressively, creating a little delta cluster. So like this 850 is holding fairly well right now. It's based on our distribution region, one of the last areas to hold for this buy side. It's looking pretty good. S&P, same thing. You get about 1,000 buyers that come in, they hold the bid, and what you're seeing is larger quantities coming in on the bid side right here, right? 600s holding. So both of these areas are rebidding into these lows that are allowing us to find this temporary bottom at this point, right? We can see a little bottom from these areas because if you come back down to this 24, 23 on the S&P and they sweep it back up, you're seeing the opportunity for these guys to actually sustain a bid and potentially move up where we target about 36, 37 on the NASDAQ, where we target maybe closer to about I would say around that 915 realistically. So that 915 where the last large sweep of the reoffers came in. So NASDAQ comes in, sweeps a bit lower, 945, 950 is our area. If we can bid above this 845, 850, if we can bid above this 850, realistically, that would hold. Still some decent sellers. So if I'm trading NASDAQ, right, and I'm long 847, let's say, I generally trade it with 15, 20 point stop. Decent rebid comes in. If we can just continuously hold into the bid into these lows like the S&P just did, right, you can see it pulls back, rebids back up, sweeps back up. This area should present, right, that final buy where we can sweep up maybe 20, 30 points on the NAS, maybe 5, 10 on the S&P before we continue some of that downside momentum. Because again, if you're looking at this from a perspective of bullish versus bearish, the DOM is still fairly bearish on these moves. But we're seeing an area, it's an area from the auction. Not only that, but we're starting to see a struggle on the sell side that's coming in. They keep trying to sell into this low, but new buyers keep appearing and they're trying to hold out these areas. So at this point, I wouldn't mind trying to risk some for these longs to see if we can get a sweep higher, because these bids are holding a lot better at this point. So you're starting to see the accumulation, big sellers right into this 850 on NASDAQ, and then they start dying out, right? What I mean by dying out, they're getting exhausted. You're seeing very small quantities that are coming in, which is not at all what we were used to before. When we're used to this selling from before, what we would see is just massive sell quantities that would come in. And where do they come in? They come in towards these lows where the big buyer steps in again. From this large sell quantity, right, about 100 go in at the bid, they drop down into single digits, larger quantities coming in 20s, 30s, and what happens? We hold a rebid into this area. The same thing with this S&P. So let's see. Very strong reaction here. There's that continued rebid and there's that move. Because we come into this area, they create all this negative delta, hundreds and hundreds try to sell again, and immediately they spike back up. Realistically, I'd be targeting above this 870 if we can actually make that press, right, where they kind of sold from the last time. And potentially into that 910, 915 on this NAS after our We saw all those rebids, failed selling into lows, right? There's some big sellers that are coming in that are getting pushed aside by the buy side right now. And I also want to take note of where these big sellers came in before, because they're most likely to come in again at those areas. 880 just traded. S&P runs up into this 32. Where would I target S&P? Like 36 to 38, where those clusters came up, right? Where that big seller dropped in. So if I see like this move that comes up into like 915 area, 912 on the NASDAQ, that should be the continuation. That's where that big sell actually swept into these lows. It's the same thing with the S&P. If I see like into like 36, 38, that's where the area that I would expect to see that larger downside move continue. Like as long as we hold above this like 40, like 845 area, where all this like negative delta shaped up on the NASDAQ, I think it should be fine at that point to see if we can actually get that little spike to the upside. The S&P is the same thing. As long as we can hold above like 24 area, we could see that little spike that comes in. Not to be confused, as DOM is still fairly bearish because you're still seeing a little more stern reactions on the sell side. This could just be a little relief bounce where like some stops are getting taken out before we see that next continued move. So we come into the area again. What happens? Large sellers are coming in, right? Big sellers are trying. Big sellers are trying on this Nasdaq, right? Very large quantities of sell. Very similar here to the S&P, right? You're getting like 500s, 300s, and what happens? You get this spike up on that big buy, right? 400s come in. 500s trying to sell into this area on the S&P, right? 600 on the sell, rebid. So the spike that comes in, same thing here with the Nasdaq on all these sellers, is telling you, okay, this area is actually holding fairly well, right? We can actually see, as long as this area holds, there's still some potential to see some of this upside sweep. I'm not getting super ecstatic about it, right? This is like pretty much the final buy spot for us to hold out. So I don't want to be like crazy long about this, but as long as we hold these areas, right, on these constant rebids, we should see some of these sweeps to the upside that will hold this thing out. They're trying to sell some quantities here on the NAS, on the S&P, but you can see some of that buy side is getting a little more excited. Decent sell quantities are coming in into like 870 again on NASDAQ. But what's going on, right? They're not as aggressive as they were before, meaning that the push to the downside isn't right like what we would see from a reoffer. I don't want it to sweep like 5-10 points on the reoffer so that we can see, okay, this is like a decent quantity that's coming in and actually sustaining some of the momentum. Same thing with the S&P. We're just holding a constant bid right now. And you see smaller quantities are coming in on the sell side here on the NASDAQ, which I'm not necessarily worried about if I'm long these areas. And like when the big quantities come in, the buy side just like eats them up and pushes higher. Again, as long as we can hold these areas, like I don't think it's a bad opportunity, but If we reoffer again at this like 870, 880 area on the NASDAQ, then I get a little worried, honestly. But you're seeing the accumulation of all this negative delta. Big sellers are coming into the lows, are getting trapped on the NASDAQ here. So this becomes a decent area that I want to sustain some of this buy side. You're getting big buyers that came in, right? A sweep of 140 that come in at the ask on the NAS at 859. And what happens, right? They press up a decent amount. So I'm on board, right? I like this. I like the idea of this long. That was a nice big buyer that stepped in. Large quantities are trying to sweep now above some of these highs. Trying again into this 880. And there you go. You're starting to see that sweep above these guys. Constant bidding, larger quantities on the bid, reacting fairly well. S&P running as well. And remember the area where the prior sellers came in, closer to 912, 915. Some fight is trying to happen at this 897 right now. Reaction, buy side. So we're still pretty good on this buy. S&P runs up into this 36 area. This is where I get nervous, pretty much on both of these. If I'm long, right? I don't want to be like super long into these areas. NASDAQ still trying to hold. And remember, around this 912, 915, that would be one of the ultimate targets because that's where a big sweep on the sell side came through. So at this point, right, we can pinpoint where that big buyer came in, which was all the way down at this 59, right? There's some positive delta that are trying to hold, right? A nice reaction at 870, 75. So that becomes a decent area on if we can hold it. This thing actually does want to pull back a little more before we get into our targeted region. S&P starting to get a little weak around that 36, 37. NASDAQ getting a little weak around that 900. A nice big buyer at 900 right now. Let's see if they can sweep it up into around 950, 912. S&P starting to fail here a little more. There's that press. They're starting to get very active here. Big buyers coming in, trying to hold this NAS. The sweep to the upside isn't super impressive right now. There's that target into that 912 area. Huge buyer comes in at 912, right at the ask. Right, I'm getting a little nervous here because they should sweep it up super aggressively, and that's a reoffer. Right, they reoffer the same areas they did before. We just dropped about like 8 handles from the region. S&P as well. We come into that 36, 37 area, immediate reoffer. This should be it, right? That's your reoffer right there. You saw massive buy quantities that came in and immediately got rejected into that region on the NASDAQ, right? The S&P, very similar case as well. And there's that sweep lower where we should see a little continuation, right? We still have a big barrier close to this like 850 area. But again, 915 is the first region where that big seller should come in. You also have above that the 925 where those big sellers come in. And then you see how the day shapes up. So this is a very long-winded explanation of the first like 45 minutes of the market here and how this order flow shaped up. But I hope it really opened up your understanding to what first a bearish drive looks like off the open, a bearish DOM, what a bearish DOM looks like, how that reoffer continues, where the rebids can be found, and where your kind of spots of interest should be, because we planned those out based on the auctions, right? We just simply looked at where the auctions would hold, and we just relayed that information in terms of reactions on the DOM. So on NASDAQ, what did we say, right? The bottom band of this auction, where that large distribution starts, is around 840, right, into that area. We saw the bits coming in towards that area. We saw the drop off under the volume into that 925, 930. Once we reoffer that, that area should hold, and we should see some consistency through those areas. We found areas in between as well. Same thing with the S&P based off these auctions. And let's take a look at what this looks like once the day is complete, actually, in both of these assets. So if we wrap this up and take a look at what had happened here on the NASDAQ, right, at the areas that we had pinpointed before, you can see around this 915, we got a decent drop, right? We come back into the same area, we get an even more extended drop that creates a new low. So into these regions, right, and especially up here, we have two regions around 915 and 930, where we would expect this offer to continue, especially once we make a new low. We hold that 800, which is a distribution area as well, that we had pinpointed from before, right, into this 800 right here based on that distribution. We hold it okay, fine, right? I'm not saying that I would have been long into this area, but looking for the shorts back into this to continue that momentum is great. You drop under 800, right, you're going to see that continuation to the downside. So we eventually drop under the 800, they hold it on the offer, and we get this large sweep to the downside. So we compare the distribution areas to what had happened into yesterday's close, right, which was fairly aggressive on the sell side. We can take a look at more information here and get a better understanding of what was going on. So if I mark these areas off, right, we can see that, okay, if we start reoffering under this 780, 800 area, right, somewhere over here, realistically, that should hold as a resistance all the way down into around that 730. If we reoffer under the 730, what happens is we accept into a new distribution to the downside where we could see that 670 realistically, 670, 660. So we reoffer those areas, right? We hold them fairly well. We drop down into about 660, 670, and then we drop even below that. That holds on the offer as we come down based on this distribution. So we could look to sell some of these areas. And then the next target would be down into the bottom of this band, which happens to be around 625. So 625, right, we eventually trade that area. We hold a lot into the close of the day, and we move up. So right now, we're just kind of holding out into these areas. We're sustaining above this 670 region, so we've accepted into a distribution a little higher, but the top band of this area around 730 is very important to us. We take a look at the S&P in a similar light, what happened yesterday compared to these distributions, we'll get a good understanding of what's going on with this as well. So we look at this, right? We take a look at the S&P. We take a look at what happened yesterday. We get a nice little rebid off of our area a few times into that 24. We hold into 36, 38, and then that continues with a large cluster. We make a move under 20, that makes that move lower, right? If we take a look at this, under this area, we accepted this distribution. Under the 5,300, right, we should accept lower. We have an area at the 90, okay, great. The target would be down to the bottom band of this distribution, the low 70. So we get that move, right? Eventually we bottom out close to that low 70, and now we're trading back into that 290. So if we're trying to change the structure and look for upside momentum, realistically, I would like prices above that 5,300 area, because that 5,300 area, we had a lot of delta in the prior sessions that led up to this massive spike that moved into all-time highs. So it was a long-winded video, but I think it was a great explanation in terms of looking for bearish DOMs, looking for rebids, reoffers that allow us to see how the momentum in this market is actually shifting. And when we combine that with auction theory, we get a very encompassing overall movement and strategy for our decision-making process. So if you enjoyed the video, there's more like these to come, and you just let me know what you want to see.